The scream that tore through the night air wasn't Catherine Carter's first, but something in its raw desperation made even the hardened men of Millfield pause in their revelry. Through the grimy window of the saloon, they could see her silhouette against the lamplight, rounded with child, facing down Timothy Brooks, with a steadiness that defied everything they knew about how this story should end. 6 months earlier, no one would have bet a bent penny on the fat, pregnant woman who stepped off the westbound stage into the dust and judgment of Millfield. Catherine Carter carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned that the world measured women by their waistlines and wedding rings, finding her lacking in both respects. Her condition was obvious beneath the worn traveling dress, her face fuller than fashion demanded, her circumstances written in the threadbare fabric in the way she clutched a single carpet bag like a lifeline. The stage driver, Robert James, helped her down with the perfunctory courtesy afforded to paying passengers, but his eyes held the same cold assessment she had grown accustomed to receiving. Where was her husband? What respectable woman traveled alone in such a state? The questions hung unspoken in the desert air, heavy as the August heat that pressed down on the ramshackle collection of buildings that dared call itself a town. Catherine had learned not to answer questions that weren't asked aloud. She had learned many things in the months since her world had crumbled. Lessons borrowed written in hunger and humiliation, in doors slammed in her face and opportunities that evaporated the moment her condition became apparent. She had learned that survival required a different kind of strength than she had ever imagined needing, and that sometimes the only choice left was to keep moving toward an uncertain horizon. Millfield squatted in the Nevada territory like a festering wound, born of silver dreams and sustained by the kind of men who found opportunity in lawlessness. It was the sort of place where questions about a woman's past were considered poor manners, not out of kindness, but because everyone had secrets they preferred to keep buried. Catherine had counted on this when she'd chosen her destination, one of the few places desperate enough for women that they might overlook her obvious disadvantages. The main street stretched before her like a gauntlet, lined with false-fronted buildings that promised more than they could deliver. The Silver Dollar Saloon dominated one corner, its bat-wing doors swinging constantly as men stumbled in and out, their laughter sharp with whiskey and cruelty. Across the street, Henderson's General Store displayed goods behind dusty windows, while the barbershop doubled as the town's medical facility when the need arose. At the far end, she could make out the skeletal frame of a church that had never been completed, its ambitions abandoned like so many others in this place. But it was the man emerging from the saloon who commanded her attention, not through any desire of her own, but through the sudden hush that fell over the street. Timothy Brooks moved with the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered meaningful opposition, his expensive clothes at odds with the rough frontier setting. He was handsome in the way that dangerous men often were, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to catalog weaknesses with predatory precision. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. Catherine felt his gaze settle on her like a physical weight, assessing and dismissing her in the same moment. She had encountered men like Timothy Brooks before, men who viewed women as commodities to be acquired or obstacles to be removed. The slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth told her everything she needed to know about her prospects in Millfield, but she was past the luxury of choice. The boarding house sat at the end of a side street, a two-story structure that had seen better decades. Martha Murphy, the proprietress, emerged onto the sagging porch as Catherine approached, her expression cycling through curiosity, calculation, and barely concealed distaste. She was a thin woman with graying hair pulled back severely, her dress practical but clean, her manner suggesting someone who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of frontier respectability. "I need a room," Catherine said simply, setting her carpet bag down carefully. "I can pay for a week in advance." Martha's eyes traveled over Catherine's form with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen every variety of human desperation. "We're a respectable establishment," she said finally, the words carrying implications that hung in the air between them. "I'm not asking you to compromise your standards," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the familiar burn of judgment. "I'm asking for a room and the same courtesy you'd extend to any paying customer." Something in Catherine's tone, perhaps the quiet dignity that poverty and pregnancy hadn't managed to strip away, seemed to give Martha pause. She studied the younger woman's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the careful way she held herself, the absence of desperation despite her obvious circumstances. "Hotel," Martha said finally, suggested, and Catherine nodded, reaching into her reticule to count out the precious coins. She had enough money for perhaps 3 weeks if she was careful, long enough to find work or, well, there had to be alternatives. There had to be. The room was small and spare, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair positioned near the window that looked out onto the main street. Catherine set her carpet bag on the bed and moved to the window, watching the ebb and flow of life in Millfield. Men moved with purpose or aimlessness depending on their fortunes, while the few women she observed seemed to fall into two distinct categories: those who hurried with eyes downcast, and those who met the world with brazen defiance. As the sun began its descent toward the jagged horizon, Catherine made her first foray into Millfield's business district. She had decided to begin with Henderson's General Store, reasoning that a merchant might have need of someone who could read and write, skills that were often in short supply in frontier towns. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and Daniel Howard looked up from his ledger with the weary expression of a man who had learned to expect trouble from unexpected visitors. Daniel was perhaps 40, with thinning brown hair and the soft build of someone who spent his days behind a counter rather than working with his hands. His eyes, however, were sharp with the intelligence that successful merchants cultivated, and Catherine could see him calculating her worth as a potential customer or threat within moments of her entrance. "Get having," he asked, his tone neutral but watchful. "Well, Gwendolyn," Catherine said directly, having learned that circumlocution was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I can read, write, and cipher. I've kept books for businesses back east." Daniel's gaze flickered to her condition, then back to her face. What would 11? For a moment, Catherine thought she saw interest flicker in Daniel's eyes. The ledger before him was clearly the work of someone more comfortable with physical goods than numerical abstractions, and she could see several obvious errors from where she stood. But then his expression closed off, and she knew what was coming before he spoke. "I'm sorry, but I don't have any positions available," he said, not unkindly but with finality. "You might try the restaurant. Helen Sanders sometimes needs help in the kitchen." Catherine thanked him and left, though they both knew he was lying about the positions. She had seen the chaos of his record-keeping, the dust accumulating on merchandise that should have been moving, the general air of a business that was surviving rather than thriving. But she had also seen the calculation in his eyes, the quick assessment of what her presence in his store would mean for his standing in the community. The restaurant was a small establishment wedged between the barbershop and a building that appeared to be abandoned. The sign above the door proclaimed it Helen's Place in faded letters, and the smell of cooking food drew Catherine inside despite her dwindling optimism. Helen Sanders proved to be a woman of perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and arms that spoke of years spent lifting heavy pots and dealing with difficult customers. "You're the woman who came in on today's stage," Helen said without preamble, not looking up from the stew she was stirring. It wasn't a question. "What daughter's 16, quote 17, quote 18. Helen finally looked at her, and Catherine saw something different in this woman's eyes. Not pity exactly, but a recognition that spoke of shared understanding of how the world treated women who found themselves outside conventional boundaries. "I could use help with the washing up," Helen said slowly. "The serving too, when it gets busy, but I can't pay much and the work is hard." "How much?" "$1 a day, plus you can eat one meal here, but—" Helen hesitated, glancing toward the window that looked out onto the main street. "You should know that Timothy Brooks owns the building. He owns most of the buildings in town, and he doesn't much care for complications." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. What kind of complications? The kind that come from having unmarried pregnant women working in his establishments. He's got strong opinions about morality, at least the kind that applies to other people. The warning was clear, but Catherine found herself nodding anyway. "When would I start?" "Tomorrow morning. 5 o'clock. We serve breakfast to the miners before they head out." Catherine thanked her and stepped back into the street, where the saloon was beginning to come alive with the sounds of men seeking to wash away the day's disappointments or celebrate its small victories. She could see Timothy Brooks through the window, holding court at a corner table. his presence commanding attention even in a room full of rough men accustomed to violence and hardship. As she watched, a young woman approached his table, her dress bright and her smile practiced. Catherine recognized the type, women who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of frontier masculinity by offering what men wanted while protecting what little they could of themselves. The woman said something that made Timothy laugh. But there was something predatory in the sound that made Catherine step back into the shadows. She was turning to leave when she noticed another figure watching the scene unfold. Christopher Price stood in the doorway of what appeared to be a small office, his attention focused on the saloon with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. He was perhaps 35, tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, and there was something in his posture that suggested competence and self-reliance. As if sensing her scrutiny, Christopher turned and their eyes met across the dusty street. For a moment, Catherine felt exposed, as if he could see through her carefully constructed facade to the desperation beneath. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet assessment that seemed to catalog her presence without condemning it. The moment passed, and Christopher disappeared back into his office, leaving Catherine to wonder what role he played in Millfield's complex social ecosystem. She made her way back to the boarding house, her mind churning with the day's discoveries and the challenges that lay ahead. Martha Murphy was waiting in the parlor when Catherine returned, her expression suggesting that news traveled quickly in a town the size of Millfield. The older woman gestured to a chair across from her own, and Catherine settled herself carefully, preparing for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Quote 28. Martha began without preamble. Quote 29. Catherine waited, having learned that information freely given was often more valuable than that which had to be extracted. Quote 30. Martha continued. Quote 30 by quote 30. Martha's smile was thin and humorless. He wants Helen to sell. The building's in a prime location, and he's got plans for something more profitable than serving meals to minors. Helen's been holding out, but Timothy's not a patient man. Catherine felt the familiar weight of being caught in circumstances beyond her control. What does that have to do with me? Timothy doesn't like complications, and you're a complication just by existing. A pregnant woman without a husband, working in his building, drawing attention he doesn't want. He's got a reputation to maintain, and that reputation depends on keeping Millfield respectable enough to attract investors, but rough enough to discourage interference from territorial authorities. So what are you telling me? Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. I'm telling you to be careful. Timothy's got ways of dealing with problems, and they're not always legal. There have been accidents before, people who crossed him finding themselves on the wrong end of bad luck. Catherine absorbed this information, adding it to the growing catalog of dangers that seemed to surround her. Why are you warning me? Because I've been where you are, Martha said simply. Maybe not exactly, but close enough. I know what it's like to have the world decide you're disposable. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the street outside. Through the parlor window, Catherine could see a group of men gathered around something or someone, their voices raised in excitement or anger. Martha rose and moved to the window, her expression darkening as she took in the scene. What is it? Catherine asked, joining her at the window. Looks like trouble at the Silvered Polar. Timothy's got someone backed up against the wall. Catherine could see the crowd now, and at its center, Timothy Brooks looming over a smaller figure. Even from a distance, she could sense the menace in his posture, the way the other men formed a circle that was both audience and barrier to escape. The victim appeared to be one of the saloon girls, her bright dress torn and her face streaked with tears or blood. Shouldn't someone help her? Catherine asked, though even as she spoke, she knew the answer. Who's going to stand up to Timothy Brooks? Martha replied bitterly. The sheriff's in his pocket, half the men in town owe him money, and the other half are too scared to cross him. That girl knew the risks when she took the job. Catherine watched as Timothy raised his hand, and even through the glass and distance, she could feel the violence radiating from the scene. The girl cowered, her hands raised protectively, while the crowd of men watched with the fascination of spectators at a blood sport. Then, unexpectedly, another figure stepped into the circle. Christopher Price moved with calm deliberation, placing himself between Timothy and the girl. Catherine couldn't hear the words exchanged, but she could see the tension in both men's postures, the way the crowd shifted nervously as the confrontation took on a new dimension. Timothy's face darkened with fury, but Christopher didn't back down. He said something that made Timothy's hand drop, though the rage in the larger man's expression promised that this was far from over. After a long moment, Timothy stepped back, his smile returning but carrying a cold promise of retribution. The crowd began to disperse, and Catherine watched as Christopher helped the girl to her feet, speaking to her quietly before escorting her away from the saloon. Timothy remained in the street, his gaze following their retreat with an expression that made Catherine's blood run cold. Christopher, Martha said quietly to her, unto her, quote. Catherine continued to watch as Christopher disappeared into the shadows between buildings, the injured girl beside him. Something about his actions, the quiet way he had stepped into danger without hesitation, stirred something in her that she had thought lost forever. In a world where she had learned to expect nothing but judgment and exploitation, the simple act of one person protecting another seemed almost miraculous. The next morning arrived with the harsh clarity that desert dawns brought to difficult truths. Catherine rose before the sun, her body protesting the unfamiliar bed and the weight she carried. The child within her had been restless during the night, as if sensing the tension that surrounded their precarious situation. She dressed carefully in her one good working dress, a practical garment that had seen better days but still maintained a semblance of respectability. Helen's place was already alive with activity when Catherine arrived, the older woman moving with efficient purpose as she prepared for the morning rush. The restaurant was larger than it appeared from the street, with a dozen tables that could seat perhaps 40 people when full. The kitchen occupied the rear half of the building, separated from the dining area by a half wall that allowed Helen to keep watch over both domains simultaneously. You're punctual, Helen observed, handing Catherine an apron. That's more than I can say for most of the help I've had. Can you handle a coffee pot without dropping it? Catherine tied the apron around her expanding waist and nodded. I think I can manage. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as the miners began arriving for breakfast before their shift. They were hard men, weathered by sun and labor, but most were polite enough in their interactions. Catherine found herself falling into the rhythm of the work, pouring coffee, taking orders, and clearing tables with an efficiency that surprised her. It was during a brief lull that she noticed Christopher Price enter the restaurant. He chose a table near the window, positioning himself where he could observe the street while maintaining a clear view of the kitchen. When Catherine approached with the coffee pot, he looked up with the same quiet assessment she remembered from the previous evening. Coffee, she asked, maintaining the professional demeanor she had cultivated. Please, and whatever Helen recommends for breakfast. His voice was deeper than she had expected, with traces of an accent she couldn't quite place. As she poured his coffee, she noticed his hands, scarred but clean, with the calluses that spoke of honest work. There was something reassuring about his presence, a steadiness that contrasted sharply with the volatile energy that seemed to permeate the rest of Millfield. Quote 55, he observed, not making it a question. Quote 56, Catherine confirmed, then found herself adding, quote 57. Christopher's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Quote 58. Before Catherine could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and Timothy Brooks entered with two companions. The conversation in the restaurant didn't exactly stop, but it shifted, becoming more subdued as the men took note of Timothy's presence. He surveyed the room with the casual arrogance of ownership before his gaze settled on Catherine. Quote, Timothy said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. Quote 6 a.m. Catherine felt every eye in the restaurant turn toward her, the weight of scrutiny pressing down like a physical force. She straightened her shoulders and continued her work, clearing a nearby table with deliberate care. Timothy's companions, Douglas Thomas and another man she didn't recognize, flanked him as he approached the counter where Helen was working. Quote 61. Helen said evenly, not looking up from the eggs she was preparing. Quote 62. Quote 63, Timothy replied, his tone deceptively casual. Quote 64. Catherine could feel the tension radiating from Helen, though the older woman's hands remained steady as she worked. The other customers seemed to sense the undercurrent of threat. several finishing their meals more quickly than necessary and leaving coins on their tables before departing. "Everything's fine," Helen said. "Business is good." "I'm sure it is, though I notice you have made some changes to your staff." Timothy's gaze shifted to Catherine, who was now wiping down tables with perhaps more attention than they required. Quote, the implied threat was clear, and Catherine felt her face flush with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She had encountered men like Timothy before, those who used their power to crush anyone they perceived as vulnerable or inconvenient. But she had also learned that showing weakness only invited further cruelty. Quote 69. Catherine said quietly, not looking up from her work, but making sure her voice carried clearly. Quote 70. A hush fell over the restaurant, and Catherine could feel the shock ripple through the remaining customers. No one spoke to Timothy Brooks that way, especially not unmarried pregnant women with no protection and nowhere else to go. She could sense Helen's tension ratcheting higher, and even Christopher seemed to have gone very still at his table. Timothy's smile was sharp as a blade. It was 71. He turned and walked out, his companions following, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Catherine's hands were shaking as she continued her work, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. She had crossed a line, and there would be consequences, but the alternative had been to accept the kind of humiliation that would have made her position untenable anyway. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Helen said quietly once the door had closed behind Timothy. "Probably both," Catherine admitted, "but I've found that bullies rarely stop with just one victory. Better to make a stand early than to spend your life retreating." Christopher Price finished his breakfast and approached the counter to pay. As he placed his coins on the worn wood, he spoke quietly, his words meant for Catherine alone. "If you need anything," he said, "my office is across the street. The sign says Price Freight. Sometimes it helps to have someone watching." Catherine met his eyes and saw something there that she hadn't encountered in months. Genuine concern without expectation of payment or favor in return. She nodded her thanks, and Christopher left, but his words remained with her as the morning progressed. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Catherine could feel the weight of Timothy's attention like a storm gathering on the horizon. Other customers seemed more subdued, and she noticed several glances in her direction that ranged from curiosity to concern. Word of her confrontation with Timothy was spreading, and in a town the size of Millfield, that kind of attention was rarely beneficial. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine found herself thinking about Christopher's offer. She had learned to be wary of men who offered help, knowing that such generosity usually came with strings attached. But there had been something different about his demeanor, a quality she couldn't quite define, but that seemed to promise safety rather than exploitation. When her shift ended, Catherine stepped out into the harsh afternoon light to find Timothy Brooks waiting for her. He leaned against the wall of the building next door, his posture casual, but his eyes cold with promise. The street was busy enough that she wasn't in immediate physical danger, but his presence was a clear message about the precariousness of her situation. Quote 77. He said, pushing away from the wall as she emerged. Quote 78. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't believe we have anything to discuss." "Oh, but we do." Timothy's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Quote 81. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain upright. Whatever Timothy had discovered, whatever threads of her previous life he had managed to unravel, she couldn't afford to show weakness now. "My past is my own business," she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Sit. I wonder what the good people of Millfield would think if they knew the whole truth about their newest resident, about the scandal that drove you west, about the man whose name you refused to speak." Catherine felt the world tilt around her, the careful construct of her new identity threatening to crumble under the weight of Timothy's knowledge. But even as panic clawed at her throat, she recognized the game he was playing. This was how men like Timothy operated, using information as a weapon, leveraging secrets to maintain control. Quote 84, she asked, abandoning any pretense of ignorance. Timothy's smile widened, and Catherine knew that she had just walked into a trap that had been carefully prepared for her arrival. "Now that's a much more interesting conversation," he said, stepping closer. "Why don't we discuss this somewhere more private?" The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, and Catherine realized that she stood at a crossroads that would determine not just her immediate future, but the kind of person she would become in this harsh new world. Behind her lay the safety of retreat, the possibility of fleeing once again to another town, another failed attempt at starting over. Before her stood Timothy Brooks in whatever demands he was prepared to make, backed by knowledge that could destroy the fragile life she was trying to build. But as she looked into his predatory eyes, Catherine felt something harden inside her chest, a resolve that had been forged in months of humiliation and desperation. She had run far enough, compromised enough, accepted enough judgment from men who viewed her as disposable. Whatever Timothy Brooks thought he knew about her past, whatever leverage he believed he possessed, she was no longer the frightened woman who had fled her previous life. The confrontation that would define her future in Millfield was about to begin, and for the first time in months, Catherine Carter was ready to fight back. The words hung between them like a loaded gun, and Catherine felt the familiar taste of copper fear flood her mouth. Timothy Brooks stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel satisfaction dancing in his dark eyes. Behind him, the sun continued its descent toward the jagged mountains, painting the sky the color of dried blood. "I think the silver dollar would be more appropriate for our discussion," Timothy said, his voice carrying the mock courtesy that dangerous men used when they held all the cards. More private, more comfortable. Catherine's mind raced through her limited options. The street around them was busy enough that Timothy wouldn't risk open violence, but it was also full of his employees, his debtors, men who had learned that crossing Timothy Brooks carried consequences they couldn't afford. The saloon would be his territory entirely, surrounded by his people, with no witnesses who would speak against him. Quote, Kira 89. Catherine replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Quote, Timothy's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, I don't think you understand the delicacy of your situation, Miss Carter. Or should I say, Mrs. Harrison, though I suppose that name brings back unpleasant memories." The blood drained from Catherine's face at the sound of her former married name, the identity she had buried along with everything else from her previous life. Timothy saw her reaction and his smile widened, predatory and satisfied. Coach 92. Catherine felt the weight of every eye on the street, though she knew most of the passers-by were too absorbed in their own struggles to pay attention to what appeared to be a simple conversation. But Timothy's words carried clearly enough, and she could see Douglas Thomas positioning himself where he could observe the exchange while appearing to mind his own business. "What do you want?" Catherine asked again, abandoning any pretense of ignorance. Whatever game Timothy was playing, he clearly held information that could destroy what little she had managed to build in Millfield. "Now that's a more productive attitude," Timothy said, his tone shifting to something that might have been mistaken for friendliness by someone who didn't know better. Quote 97. Timothy glanced around the street, then back to Catherine with an expression of exaggerated concern. Quote 97. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Timothy wanted Catherine to sabotage Helen's restaurant from within, to create problems that would force the older woman to sell. It was elegant in its cruelty, using Catherine's desperation and her need for employment as weapons against the one person in Millfield who had shown her kindness. Quote, Timothy corrected smoothly. Quote, Catherine felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, a crystalline clarity that cut through the fear and uncertainty that had clouded her thinking for months. She had spent so long running, so long accepting whatever scraps the world was willing to throw her way, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have principles worth defending. 101. Timothy's mask of false friendliness slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Then I'm afraid your past might become a topic of conversation among Millfield's more respectable citizens." Amazing how quickly a woman's reputation can be destroyed by the right words in the right ears. "And of course, there's the matter of your current living arrangements. Martha Murphy runs a respectable boarding house. I wonder how she'd feel about harboring a woman of questionable moral character." The threat was clear and comprehensive. Timothy had identified every pillar of Catherine's precarious new life and was prepared to destroy them all if she didn't comply with his demands. It was the kind of systematic cruelty that she had encountered before, the way powerful men dismantled the lives of those who dared to resist them. But as Catherine looked into Timothy's eyes, she realized something had changed within her during the months of struggle and humiliation. The woman who had fled Philadelphia in shame and terror was still there, but she was no longer the only voice in Catherine's head. There was something else now, something that had been forged in the crucible of loss and hardship, tempered by small acts of kindness from people like Helen and Martha, who had no reason to help her beyond simple human decency. "I need time to think about this," Catherine said finally. Timothy's expression darkened. Quote 104. He turned and walked away, Douglas Thomas falling into step beside him, leaving Catherine standing alone in the gathering dusk. She watched them disappear into the silver dollar, her mind churning with the impossible choice Timothy had laid before her. Betray Helen and become complicit in Timothy's schemes, or face the destruction of everything she had managed to build in Millfield. As she stood there, struggling with the weight of her decision, Catherine became aware of a presence beside her. She turned to find Christopher Price, his expression grave as he studied her face. "That didn't look like a friendly conversation," he observed quietly. Catherine almost laughed at the understatement, but the sound that emerged was closer to a sob. "No, it wasn't." Christopher glanced toward the saloon, then back to Catherine. "My office is across the street, if you'd like somewhere quiet to think." The offer was made without pressure or expectation, and Catherine found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to accept. They crossed the dusty street in silence, and Christopher opened the door to a small but well-organized space that served as both office and living quarters. The front room contained a desk, several chairs, and shelves lined with ledgers and correspondence. Through an open doorway, Catherine could see a simple bedroom and a small kitchen area. "Coffee?" Christopher asked, moving toward the kitchen without waiting for an answer. Catherine sank into one of the chairs, feeling the exhaustion of the day settle into her bones. The baby stirred restlessly within her, as if responding to her emotional turmoil, and she placed a protective hand over her rounded belly. "He knows about my past," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Timothy, he's been making inquiries," and Christopher returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting one before Catherine and settling into the chair across from her. "How much does he know?" The question was asked without judgment, and Catherine found herself studying Christopher's face for signs of the disgust or condemnation she had grown accustomed to receiving. Instead, she saw only quiet attention and what might have been sympathy. Catherine admitted. Catherine told him about Timothy's demands, about the impossible choice between betraying Helen and facing complete social destruction. As she spoke, she watched Christopher's expression grow increasingly grim, though his anger seemed directed at Timothy rather than at her circumstances. "The 115 to Christopher," said when she finished. "Till 116 to quote 117. Christopher was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions Catherine hadn't dared to ask. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite identify. He said quietly. Catherine felt tears threaten for the first time since arriving in Millfield. Not tears of self-pity, but tears of frustration at the impossible position Timothy had maneuvered her into. She had thought herself beyond such manipulation, had believed that losing everything once had somehow inoculated her against further cruelty. But Timothy had found her weak points with surgical precision, identifying exactly what she couldn't afford to lose. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't go back to what I was before. I can't run again. This baby," she touched her belly protectively, "this baby deserves better than a mother who's always looking over her shoulder, always one step ahead of scandal and ruin." Christopher leaned forward, his expression intent. "Tell me about Philadelphia." The request caught Catherine off guard. She had spent so many months carefully constructing a version of herself that had no past, no history beyond what people could observe in the present moment. The idea of voluntarily sharing the truth felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. "I was married to a man named Richard Harrison," she began slowly. "He was successful, respected, everything a woman was supposed to want in a husband. But he was also cold, controlling, and—" She paused, searching for words that could convey the suffocating reality of her marriage, without descending into self-pity. "He hurt you," Christopher said simply. Catherine nodded, surprised by how easily he had understood what she couldn't bring herself to say directly. She told Christopher about the years of careful submission, the gradual erosion of her sense of self, the way Richard had isolated her from friends and family until his approval became the only measure of her worth. She told him about the pregnancy that had briefly brought hope, the miscarriage that had plunged her into despair, and Richard's cold assessment that her grief was excessive and embarrassing. "I started visiting a physician," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Dr. Samuel Mitchell. He was kind, understanding, everything that Richard wasn't. He listened when I spoke about the sadness that seemed to follow me everywhere, the feeling that I was disappearing a little more each day." Christopher's expression remained carefully neutral, but Catherine could see the understanding in his eyes. He knew where this story was leading, could anticipate the scandal that had driven her from her former life. The memory of Richard's fury still had the power to make Catherine's hands shake. He had been like a man possessed, his careful facade of respectability cracking to reveal the cruelty beneath. The accusations had flown like weapons, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. "Quote 131, Catherine said simply. "Quote 132, quote Richard, and Catherine's hand moved protectively to her belly. "Not Richard's. I met someone after the separation, a man who showed me what kindness looked like. But when I discovered I was pregnant, he made it clear that he couldn't afford to be associated with a woman of my reputation. I was on my own." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Christopher didn't offer empty reassurances or meaningless platitudes. Instead, he simply sat with her story, allowing her the dignity of being heard without judgment. "Quote 135, he asked finally. Quote 136. Christopher stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street where evening shadows were lengthening. The silver dollar was coming alive with the sounds of men seeking to wash away the day's disappointments, and Catherine could see the glow of lamplight spilling from its windows. "There's something you should know about Timothy Brooks," Christopher said without turning around. "Something that might change how you think about your situation." Catherine felt a flicker of hope, though she tried to suppress it. She had learned to be wary of promises that seemed too good to be true, especially when they came from men who claimed to want to help her. 5 years ago, when Timothy first came to Millfield, there was another woman in a situation similar to yours. Christina Evans. She was a widow with 2 young children, trying to make a living as a seamstress. Timothy owned the building where she rented space for her shop. Christopher turned back to face Catherine, his expression grim. "Timothy made her the same kind of offer he's making you. Work for him, provide information about other business owners who might be resistant to his expansion plans, and he'd protect her reputation and her livelihood." "What happened to her?" "She refused. Said she wouldn't betray the trust of people who had shown her kindness. Timothy destroyed her, just like he's threatening to destroy you. Spread rumors about her past, made sure she couldn't find work anywhere in town, eventually forced her to leave Millfield with her children." Catherine felt her heart sink. The story confirmed her worst fears about what would happen if she refused Timothy's demands. But Christopher wasn't finished. "But here's what Timothy doesn't know," Christopher continued. "Christina didn't just disappear. She went to the territorial authorities, told them everything she knew about Timothy's business practices. The investigation is still ongoing, but there are people in Carson City who are very interested in Mr. Brooks and his methods." The information hit Catherine like a physical blow. If there was already an investigation into Timothy's activities, if the territorial authorities were building a case against him, then perhaps her situation wasn't as hopeless as it seemed. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Christopher returned to his chair, his expression serious. "Because I think you deserve to know that Timothy's power isn't as absolute as he wants people to believe. And because I think you're stronger than you know." Catherine studied his face, searching for signs of the ulterior motives she had learned to expect from men who offered help. But Christopher's expression remained open, honest, without the calculating assessment she had grown accustomed to receiving. "What character could the Christopher was quiet for a moment, and Catherine could see him weighing his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but carried an undertone of something she couldn't quite identify. "You wouldn't be alone," he said simply. The words hung between them, loaded with implications that Catherine wasn't sure she was ready to examine. She had learned to be suspicious of men who offered protection, knowing that such offers usually came with expectations that she couldn't afford to meet. But there was something different about Christopher. Something in his manner that suggested his concern was genuine rather than calculated. Before she could respond, the sound of breaking glass from the street outside shattered the quiet of the evening. Catherine and Christopher both moved to the window, where they could see a crowd gathering in front of Helen's restaurant. Even from a distance, Catherine could see that the front window had been smashed, and Helen stood in the doorway with an expression of fury and despair. "Quote 151, Christopher said grimly. Quote 152. Catherine felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. She had been prepared to sacrifice herself to Timothy's demands if necessary, but the idea that Helen would suffer for her refusal was intolerable. The older woman had shown Catherine kindness when she had no reason to do so, had offered her work and dignity when both seemed impossible to find. "I have to go to her," Catherine said, moving toward the door. Christopher caught her arm gently. "It might not be safe. Timothy's sending a message, and you being there might escalate things." Catherine looked into Christopher's eyes and saw a genuine concern for her welfare. But she also saw something else, a recognition that she was capable of making her own decisions about the risks she was willing to take. "Quote round," Catherine said quietly. "Quote watch them." Christopher nodded and released her arm. "Quote 27. They crossed the street together, Catherine's heart hammering as they approached the crowd that had gathered around Helen's restaurant. The broken window gaped like a wound in the building's facade, and shards of glass glittered in the lamplight like scattered stars. Helen stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined, surveying the damage with the grim resignation of someone who had expected this moment to arrive eventually. The crowd was mostly composed of curious onlookers, drawn by the sound of breaking glass and the promise of drama. But Catherine could see several of Timothy's associates among them, including Douglas Thomas, who watched the proceedings with barely concealed satisfaction. There was no sign of Timothy himself, but his presence hung over the scene like smoke from a distant fire. Quote 158. Catherine called out as she approached, pushing through the gathered spectators. "Got to find him." The older woman turned at the sound of Catherine's voice, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked to reveal the fear and exhaustion beneath. "No one was hurt," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "They waited until the restaurant was closed, until there were no customers inside." "Who did this?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. Helen's laugh was bitter and humorless. Quote 163. Catherine could feel the weight of the crowd's attention, the way conversations died as people recognized her and began to make connections between her presence and the attack on Helen's restaurant. She had become a catalyst for violence simply by existing, by daring to refuse the role Timothy had assigned to her. "Quote Levante," Catherine said quietly, the words carrying clearly in the evening air. Quote 165. A murmur ran through the crowd at this admission, and Catherine could see the calculation in their faces as they processed this information. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with the kind of cold assessment that frontier towns bred in their inhabitants. But all of them understood the implications of what she had said. Christopher stepped closer to Catherine, his presence a steadying force in the chaos of the moment. He said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. Quote 167. Douglas Thomas pushed forward through the crowd, his expression dark with anger. Quote 168. Quote 169. Christopher replied evenly. Quote 170. The name hit the crowd like a physical blow, and Catherine could see recognition dawning in several faces. Christina Evans had been well-liked in Millfield, and her sudden departure had left questions that no one had dared to ask openly. But Christopher's words gave voice to suspicions that had been festering in the community for years. Christina left because she wanted to, Douglas said, but his voice lacked conviction. She had family back east. Christina left because Timothy made it impossible for her to stay, Christopher countered. Just like he's trying to make it impossible for Helen to keep her restaurant and for Catherine to build a life here. The crowd was growing restless, and Catherine could sense the potential for violence in the air. Men who had spent the day in the mines or working under the desert sun were looking for someone to blame for their frustrations, and the confrontation between Christopher and Douglas was providing exactly the kind of catalyst that could turn ugly quickly. But before the situation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Timothy Brooks emerged from the shadows at the edge of the crowd, his presence commanding immediate attention. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his ability to control any situation, his expensive clothes and carefully groomed appearance marking him as a man apart from the rough laborers who made up most of Millfield's population. Quote 176. Timothy said, his tone suggesting sympathy that fooled no one present. Quote 177. The threat was barely veiled, and Catherine could see Helen's face flush with anger at Timothy's words. But before the older woman could respond, Catherine stepped forward, placing herself between Timothy and Helen. Quote, Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. Quote 179. A hush fell over the gathered spectators, and Catherine could feel the shock ripple through the crowd. No one spoke to Timothy Brooks that way, especially not a pregnant woman with no protection and nowhere else to go. But Catherine had passed beyond the point where caution could save her, and she found a strange freedom in finally speaking the truth. Timothy's expression darkened, and for a moment Catherine saw the mask of civility slip to reveal the cold fury beneath. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice carrying a warning that everyone present could hear, "I think you're overwrought. Perhaps you should retire for the evening before you say something you'll regret." "The only thing I regret," Catherine replied, "is not speaking up sooner." She turned to address the crowd, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing. "Timothy Brooks wants me to spy on Helen, to sabotage her business from within so that he can force her to sell. When I refused, this happened." She gestured to the broken window, the shattered glass that glittered in the lamplight. "He's done this before," Catherine continued, ignoring Timothy's increasingly dangerous expression. Quote 186, the crowd was murmuring now, and Catherine could see recognition dawning in several faces. People were beginning to connect incidents they had witnessed, departures they had questioned, businesses that had failed under mysterious circumstances. Quote 187, Timothy said, his voice cutting through the crowd's growing agitation. "Miss Carter is obviously distraught, not thinking clearly. Perhaps someone should escort her home before she embarrasses herself further." But Christopher stepped forward, positioning himself beside Catherine in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on anyone present. "Go tell me," said Quote. Douglas Thomas and several other men began moving through the crowd, their intentions clear. They were going to remove Catherine and Christopher by force if necessary, and the gathered spectators would be left to draw their own conclusions about what they had witnessed. But as the confrontation reached its breaking point, another voice joined the fray. Quote 180, Sheriff Marcus Webb pushed through the crowd, his badge catching the lamplight as he surveyed the scene with the weary expression of a man who had seen too much violence and corruption to be surprised by either. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent trying to maintain order in a place that had little use for law. Catherine felt a moment of hope at the sheriff's arrival, but it died quickly when she saw the way Timothy's expression relaxed into satisfaction. Whatever authority Sheriff Webb might theoretically possess, it was clear that his loyalties lay with Timothy Brooks. Quote 192. Sheriff Webb said, his tone suggesting paternal concern. Quote 93. It wasn't a suggestion, and Catherine could see the calculation in the sheriff's eyes as he assessed the situation. He was giving her a chance to retreat gracefully, to avoid the kind of confrontation that would force him to choose sides publicly. But Catherine had moved beyond the point where retreat was possible. She had spent too many months accepting whatever scraps the world was willing to throw her way, too many years allowing powerful men to dictate the terms of her existence. The moment had come to make a stand, regardless of the consequences. Quote on Myron said, quietly, quote him. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Catherine could feel the weight of every gaze in the crowd. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return, had committed herself to a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone in Millfield, who had suffered under Timothy's reign of terror. Timothy's smile was sharp as a blade, and Catherine knew that she had just declared war on a man who had never lost a battle. But as she looked around at the faces in the crowd, she saw something that gave her hope. For the first time in years, people were listening, really listening, to someone who dared to speak the truth about Timothy Brooks. The battle for Millfield was about to begin, and Catherine Carter had just fired the opening shot. Sheriff Webb's hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that was casual enough to maintain plausible deniability, but clear enough to send a message to everyone present. The crowd began to shift nervously, sensing the potential for violence in the increasingly charged atmosphere. Catherine could feel Christopher's tension beside her, could see the way his own hand had moved closer to his weapon. Quote 1, Sheriff Webb said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Quote 197. The threat was clear, and Catherine could see Timothy's satisfaction at the sheriff's intervention. But she had come too far to back down now, had finally found her voice after months of silence and submission. Quote 198. Catherine replied, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. Quote 199. A murmur ran through the gathered spectators, and Catherine could see uncertainty creeping into Timothy's expression. He had expected her to retreat when faced with official opposition, had counted on her fear of authority to silence her accusations. Prove it how, Douglas Thomas demanded, pushing forward through the crowd. With what evidence? The word of a disgraced woman with a questionable past? Catherine felt the familiar sting of shame at the public reference to her circumstances, but she pushed the feeling aside. Her past was exactly that, past, and it had no bearing on the truth of what she was saying about Timothy's actions in Millfield. Catherine said, Officer Christopher stepped forward, adding his voice to Catherine's accusations. I've been keeping track, he said quietly. Businesses forced to close in the past 2 years. 7 families driven from town under mysterious circumstances. A dozen property sales that happened at well below market value after the owners experienced sudden financial difficulties. The crowd was murmuring more loudly now, and Catherine could see recognition dawning in several faces. People were beginning to connect incidents they had witnessed, patterns they had noticed but been afraid to acknowledge openly. Timothy's expression had grown dangerous, but he maintained his facade of reasonable concern. Quote 206, quote 207, Christopher asked pointedly. Quote The question hit the crowd like a physical blow, and Catherine could see the impact in their faces. Christina Evans had been well-liked and respected, and her sudden departure had left questions that no one had dared to ask openly. Quote, Timothy said, but there was a note of strain in his voice now. Quote, quote, Catherine said, her voice growing stronger as she saw the effect her words were having on the crowd. Quote, Helen stepped forward, her face flushed with anger and determination. Quote, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. Quote, The admission sent another ripple through the crowd, and Catherine could see Timothy's carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. He had built his power on fear and intimidation, but those weapons only worked as long as people were too afraid to speak the truth openly. These are serious accusations, Sheriff Webb said, though his tone suggested he was less concerned with justice than with maintaining order. If you have evidence of criminal activity, you should file a formal complaint through proper channels. Catherine almost laughed at the suggestion. The proper channels in Millfield all led back to Timothy Brooks, who owned the sheriff as surely as he owned most of the buildings in town. The proper channels have been corrupted, Christopher said bluntly. Timothy Brooks has bought and paid for every position of authority in this town. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Catherine could see Sheriff Webb's face flush with anger at the implication. But she could also see the truth of it in his eyes. The resignation of a man who had sold his integrity so long ago that he could barely remember what it felt like to be honest. Quote 29, Timothy said, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. Quote 20, the sheriff nodded and began moving toward Catherine and Christopher, his hand still resting on his weapon. But as he approached, another voice cut through the tension. The crowd turned to see a new figure emerging from the shadows at the edge of the gathering, Robert James. The stage driver who had brought Catherine to Millfield stepped into the lamplight with an expression of grim determination. He was followed by several other men, including Daniel Howard from the general store and two miners that Catherine recognized from Helen's restaurant. "Robert," Sheriff Webb said, his voice carrying a warning, "this doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Robert replied firmly. "We've all seen what happens to people who cross Timothy Brooks. We've all kept quiet because we were afraid of what would happen if we spoke up. But maybe it's time to stop being afraid." Daniel Howard stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Timothy's been pressuring me to inflate my prices, to make it harder for people to afford basic supplies. When I refused, my shipments started arriving damaged. My credit with suppliers was mysteriously canceled." One of the miners nodded grimly. "Same thing happened to the boarding house on Cedar Street. Mrs. Patterson wouldn't sell. Well, yeah, so suddenly she couldn't get coal for heating, couldn't get food deliveries. Had to close within a month." The testimonies were adding up, and Catherine could see the impact they were having on the crowd. People were beginning to understand the scope of Timothy's control, the systematic way he had been manipulating the town's economy to serve his own interests. Timothy's expression had grown murderous, but he was trapped by the very public nature of the confrontation. He couldn't resort to his usual tactics of intimidation and violence with so many witnesses present, couldn't silence the growing chorus of voices speaking against him. He said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Christopher said calmly, "Code 231. The mention of territorial authorities hit Timothy like a physical blow, and Catherine could see genuine fear flicker across his features for the first time. Whatever power he wielded in Millfield, it didn't extend to Carson City, and the threat of outside investigation was clearly something he took seriously. "You don't want to do that," Timothy said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You really don't want to make that kind of enemy." But Christopher didn't back down. Quote 234, he replied evenly. Quote 2.35. The confrontation had reached a tipping point, and Catherine could feel the electricity in the air as both sides prepared for whatever was coming next. Timothy's hand had moved to his own weapon, and several of his associates were positioning themselves for potential violence. But before anyone could draw a gun, the sound of approaching horses cut through the tension. A group of riders was approaching from the direction of the main road, their torches creating a moving constellation of light in the desert darkness. As they drew closer, Catherine could see that they wore the uniforms of territorial marshals, and her heart began to race with a mixture of hope and terror. The arrival of outside authority could change everything, but it could also escalate the situation beyond anyone's ability to control. The lead rider dismounted as he reached the crowd, his badge catching the lamplight as he surveyed the scene with professional assessment. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of weathered face and steady demeanor that spoke of years spent dealing with frontier violence and corruption. "Uhud 36, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. Quote 237. Timothy's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure as he stepped forward to greet the marshal. "Marshal Thompson, welcome to Millfield. I'm Timothy Brooks, and I can assure you that any reports you've received have been greatly exaggerated." Marshal Thompson's eyes swept over the broken window of Helen's restaurant, the tense faces of the crowd, the obvious signs of recent conflict. "Is that so?" he said mildly. "Then perhaps you can explain why we have received multiple complaints about intimidation, extortion, and systematic corruption in this town." The words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt, and Catherine could see the shock and hope warring in people's faces. Someone had finally spoken to the territorial authorities, had brought outside attention to Timothy's reign of terror. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding," Timothy said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Millfield is a peaceful, law-abiding community." "We'll see about that," Marshal Thompson replied. "We'll be conducting interviews with residents over the next few days, and I'm sure the truth will emerge." Catherine felt a surge of hope, so intense it was almost painful. After months of feeling trapped and powerless, the possibility of justice seemed almost too good to be true. But as she looked at Timothy's face, she could see that this was far from over. A man who had built his empire on fear and intimidation wouldn't give up without a fight. The battle for Millfield had entered a new phase, and Catherine Carter found herself at the center of a conflict that would determine the future of everyone in town. Marshall Thompson's presence seemed to change the very air around the crowd, introducing a tension that was different from the fear Timothy Brooks had cultivated. This was the tension of possibility, of a world where power might actually be held accountable for its actions. Catherine could see it in the faces around her, the way people stood a little straighter, spoke a little louder, as if the Marshal's badge had given them permission to hope. "Miss Carter," Marshall Thompson said, turning his attention to her with the kind of professional courtesy that she hadn't experienced in months. "What did I 46?" Catherine felt every eye in the crowd turn toward her, the weight of the moment pressing down like a physical force. This was her chance to make Timothy pay for his crimes, to ensure that no one else would suffer the kind of systematic intimidation that had driven Christina Evans from town and threatened to destroy Helen's livelihood. But even as hope flared in her chest, Catherine could see the calculation in Timothy's eyes, the way he was already planning his counterattack. A man who had built his empire on manipulation and corruption wouldn't be brought down by a single night's revelations, no matter how damning they might be. Quote 947. Catherine said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Quote 240. Timothy's smile was sharp and cold. "I'm sure Miss Carter will be very forthcoming," he said, his tone carrying implications that made Catherine's blood run cold. Quote 250. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow, and she could see the understanding dawn in Marshall Thompson's eyes. Timothy was preparing to use her past against her, to paint her as an unreliable witness whose word couldn't be trusted against that of a respected businessman. Quote 251, Marshall Thompson asked, his tone carefully neutral. Timothy's smile widened, and Catherine knew that he was about to play his strongest card. "Miss Carter has a rather colorful history back east. A scandal involving adultery, abandonment of her marriage vows, behavior that resulted in her being cast out from respectable society. I'm sure a man of your experience understands how such circumstances might affect a person's relationship with the truth." The words hung in the air like poison, and Catherine could feel the shift in the crowd's mood. Even those who had been sympathetic to her cause were now looking at her with uncertainty, wondering what other secrets she might be hiding. Marshall Thompson studied Catherine's face with the kind of professional assessment that law enforcement officers developed over years of dealing with witnesses and suspects. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "is there truth to these allegations about your past?" Catherine felt the familiar burn of shame, the weight of judgment that had followed her from Philadelphia to this dusty street in Nevada territory. But she had come too far to retreat now, had found her voice after months of silence and submission. "There is truth to some of it," she admitted, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet crowd. "I was married to a man who was cruel and controlling. I sought comfort and understanding from a physician who treated me with kindness. My husband used that friendship to accuse me of adultery and cast me out of his house and his life." She paused, gathering her strength for what came next. "But my past has nothing to do with the truth of what I'm saying about Timothy Brooks. My personal history doesn't change the fact that he's been terrorizing this town for years." Christopher stepped closer to Catherine, his presence a steadying force in the chaos of the moment. "The marshal should also know," he said quietly, "that Timothy has been using Catherine's past to blackmail her. He demanded that she spy on Helen Sanders and sabotage her restaurant, threatening to expose her history if she refused." This revelation sent another ripple through the crowd, and Catherine could see the impact it had on Marshall Thompson. Blackmail was a serious crime, one that carried significant penalties under territorial law. "Is this true, Miss Carter?" the marshal asked. Catherine nodded, feeling a strange sense of liberation in finally speaking the truth openly. "Timothy knew details about my life in Philadelphia that he could only have learned through deliberate investigation. He threatened to use that information to destroy my reputation here unless I agreed to help him force Helen to sell her restaurant." Timothy's expression had grown dangerous, but he maintained his facade of injured innocence. Quote 262, but Marshall Thompson's attention had shifted to the broken window of Helen's restaurant, the shattered glass that glittered in the lamplight like evidence of Timothy's true nature. "And this vandalism?" the marshal asked. "How does that fit into Miss Carter's supposed campaign of deflection?" Timothy's pause was almost imperceptible, but Catherine caught it, and she could see that Marshall Thompson had noticed it as well. Potato 65, Timothy said finally. This Taiwan. Helen stepped forward, her face flushed with anger and determination. She said firmly, Marshall Thompson asked. Helen's expression faltered slightly. I didn't see who threw the rock, but the timing. Timing isn't proof, Timothy said smoothly. And I'm afraid Helen has her own reasons for making accusations against me. I've made several generous offers to purchase her building. Offers that would set her up comfortably for the rest of her life. Her refusal to accept reasonable business propositions has created some tension between us. Catherine could see how skillfully Timothy was maneuvering the conversation, turning each accusation into evidence of ulterior motives or personal grudges. He had years of experience manipulating situations to his advantage, and he was using every tool at his disposal to discredit his accusers. But Christopher wasn't finished. He said quietly, the words hit Timothy like a physical blow, and for the first time since the marshal's arrival, his composure cracked completely. Catherine could see genuine fear flicker across his features, the realization that his past victims might have found the courage to speak against him. Christina Evans is a bitter woman who left town because she couldn't make her business succeed, Timothy said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Any testimony she might have provided would be tainted by her personal animosity toward me. Marshall Thompson's expression had grown increasingly grave as he listened to the competing accounts. Quote 277. He said finally that quote 278. Timothy's hand moved toward his weapon, and Catherine could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options. He was surrounded by his own men, but they were outnumbered by the territorial marshals, and any violence would only confirm the accusations against him. Am I under arrest? Timothy asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. You're being detained for questioning, Marshall Thompson replied evenly. The nature of that detention will depend on your cooperation. For a moment, Catherine thought Timothy might resist, might try to fight his way out of the situation through violence and intimidation. But then his expression shifted, and she could see him calculating a different kind of strategy. Of course, Timothy said, his smile returning, but carrying a cold promise of retribution. I'm always happy to cooperate with law enforcement, though I hope this investigation will be thorough enough to examine the credibility of those making accusations. The threat was clear, and Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. Timothy might be facing questioning, but he wasn't defeated. Men like him had resources and connections that extended far beyond the boundaries of Millfield, and the battle was far from over. As Marshall Thompson prepared to escort Timothy away, the crowd began to disperse, people drifting back to their homes and businesses with the subdued energy of those who had witnessed something significant but weren't sure what it meant for their future. Catherine found herself standing with Christopher and Helen in the gradually emptying street, the broken window of the restaurant serving as a reminder that their victory, if it could be called that, was far from complete. What happens now? Helen asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent years fighting a battle she wasn't sure she could win. Christopher's expression was grim as he watched Timothy disappear into the marshal's temporary headquarters. Chapter 85. Catherine placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the child stir restlessly within her. She had started this confrontation to protect herself and Helen, but she was beginning to understand that the stakes were much higher than she had realized. The battle for Millfield wasn't just about one man's reign of terror. It was about whether justice could exist in a place where power had gone unchecked for too long. The real test was still to come, and Catherine Carter was no longer sure she was strong enough to face whatever Timothy Brooks had planned for his revenge. The hours that followed Marshall Thompson's arrival passed with the strange, suspended quality of a town holding its breath. Catherine returned to her room at Martha Murphy's boarding house, but sleep proved elusive as her mind churned with the events of the evening and their potential consequences. Through her window, she could see lights burning late in the marshal's temporary headquarters, and she wondered what Timothy Brooks was telling the territorial authorities about the accusations against him. Martha was waiting in the parlor when Catherine finally emerged the next morning, her expression carrying the weight of someone who had spent the night wrestling with difficult decisions. The whole town's talking about what happened last night, Martha said without preamble. Some folks are calling you brave. Others are saying you've stirred up more trouble than Millfield can handle. Catherine settled into the chair across from Martha, feeling the familiar weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. What do you think? Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying Catherine's face with the kind of assessment that came from years of observing human nature in all its complexity. Quote 289. She said finally, Catherine felt a chill at Martha's words, but she also felt a stubborn determination that surprised her with its intensity. So what are you saying, that we should have kept quiet? Let him continue terrorizing people? I'm saying you need to be prepared for the fact that men like Timothy don't go down easily. They fight back, and they don't much care who gets hurt in the process. Before Catherine could respond, a knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Martha rose to answer it, returning moments later with Christopher Price, whose expression was grim with whatever news he carried. The marshal wants to see you, Christopher said, without preamble. Both you and Helen. He's set up interviews at the church, away from Timothy's usual sphere of influence. Catherine felt her heart begin to race. The formal interview would be her chance to provide detailed testimony about Timothy's blackmail attempt and the systematic intimidation she had witnessed. But it would also expose her to the kind of scrutiny that could destroy what little she had managed to build in Millfield. She asked. Christopher's expression darkened. Released this morning, apparently his lawyer arrived on the early stage from Carson City, and they had a very productive conversation with Marshal Thompson. The news hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had allowed herself to hope that Timothy's detention might lead to formal charges, that the weight of testimony against him might be enough to break his hold on Millfield. But she should have known that a man with Timothy's resources wouldn't be stopped by a single night's questioning. So he's free? For now. But the investigation is continuing, and the marshal seems genuinely committed to getting to the truth. The question is whether Timothy will let that happen. Catherine understood the implication. Timothy would use every tool at his disposal to discredit his accusers and protect his interests. Her past would be weaponized against her, and anyone who had spoken out would face consequences that extended far beyond legal proceedings. I have to go, Catherine said, rising from her chair, with determination that surprised even her. Whatever happens, I have to tell the truth about what Timothy did. Christopher nodded, but his expression remained troubled. There's something else you should know. Timothy's been making inquiries about your situation, your pregnancy. He's looking for ways to use that against you as well. Catherine felt a surge of protective fury at the thought of Timothy targeting her unborn child, even indirectly. What kind of inquiries? Questions about the father, about your circumstances when you arrived in Millfield. He's building a case that you're an unreliable witness, someone whose testimony can't be trusted because of your moral character. The familiar shame burned in Catherine's chest, but it was accompanied now by something else, a cold anger that gave her strength rather than weakening her resolve. Timothy Brooks had made the mistake of threatening not just her, but the child she carried, and that crossed a line that she would not allow him to retreat from. They made their way to the church together, the skeletal frame of the unfinished building serving as an ironic backdrop for what might be Millfield's last chance at justice. Marshal Thompson had set up a makeshift office in the partially completed sanctuary, and Catherine could see Helen Sanders waiting nearby with the kind of nervous determination that spoke of someone preparing to risk everything on a single throw of the dice. The interview process was thorough and professional, with Marshal Thompson asking detailed questions about Timothy's blackmail attempt, the systematic intimidation of business owners, and the pattern of mysterious accidents that had befallen anyone who opposed his interests. Catherine found herself providing information she hadn't even realized she possessed, connecting incidents she had witnessed to a larger pattern of corruption and control. But even as she spoke, Catherine could see the marshal's expression growing increasingly troubled. Whatever evidence they were gathering against Timothy, it was clear that building a case would be more complicated than simply collecting testimony from his victims. Quote 306. Marshal Thompson explained when the formal interview concluded. Quote 307. Catherine felt her heart sink. Quote throughout. Quote 3. Helen stepped forward, her expression determined. Quote Sean. Marshal Thompson was quiet for a moment, and Catherine could see him weighing his words carefully. Quote, from. The implication hung in the air like smoke, and Catherine felt a chill as she understood what the marshal was suggesting. Someone would have to get close to Timothy, close enough to gain access to the kind of information that could destroy him. It was exactly the kind of dangerous game that could get someone killed. Quote three to go on, Christopher hit quietly. Quote for and quote, Marshall Thompson replied. Quote, also as Catherine found herself thinking about Timothy's original demand that she spy on Helen, and a terrible irony occurred to her. The marshal was essentially asking someone to do exactly what Timothy had tried to force her to do, except in reverse. It would have to be someone he doesn't suspect, she said slowly, the pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind. Someone he thinks he's already defeated. Christopher and Marshall Thompson both turned to look at her, and Catherine could see understanding dawning in their eyes. She was talking about herself, about using Timothy's assumptions about her weakness and desperation against him. Quote 3, we say, Christopher said firmly. Quote 319, but Catherine was already thinking through the possibilities, calculating the risks against the potential rewards. Timothy thought he had won, thought that her public exposure in the marshal's investigation had neutralized her as a threat. He might be willing to approach her again, to try to use her desperation to serve his interests. He'll come to me, Catherine said with growing certainty. Timothy doesn't like loose ends, and I represent a problem that he hasn't fully solved. He'll try to bring me back under his control, and when he does, you'll be completely at his mercy, Christopher interrupted. Catherine, you're pregnant, alone, with no protection if things go wrong. This isn't a risk you can afford to take. But Marshall Thompson was studying Catherine with the kind of professional assessment that law enforcement officers developed over years of dealing with dangerous situations. It might work, he said slowly. Timothy's arrogance could be his weakness. He might underestimate someone he thinks he's already defeated. Catherine felt a strange sense of destiny settling over her, as if all the struggles and humiliations of the past months had been leading to this moment. She had fled Philadelphia as a victim, had arrived in Millfield as a refugee seeking nothing more than survival. But perhaps it was time to stop running, to stop accepting whatever role others assigned to her. I'll do it, she said quietly, and the words carried a finality that surprised everyone present, including herself. The battle for Millfield was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and Catherine Carter was preparing to walk directly into the heart of Timothy Brooks's empire, armed with nothing but her wits and a determination that had been forged in the crucible of loss and betrayal. The real war was about to begin. The decision hung between them like a blade suspended by the thinnest thread, and Catherine could see the weight of it reflected in the faces around her. Marshall Thompson studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to measure courage against desperation, while Christopher's expression carried the kind of protective fury that she had never expected to see directed on her behalf. You don't understand what you're agreeing to, Christopher said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Timothy Brooks doesn't just destroy people who cross him. He breaks them, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but fear and regret. Catherine felt the child stir within her, a gentle reminder of the life she carried and the future she was fighting to protect. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was preparing to walk into the greatest danger she had ever faced in order to secure the safety that had eluded her for so long. Quote 329, she replied quietly. Quote 30. Marshall Thompson leaned forward, his expression grave with the responsibility of what he was about to ask. Quote Arin. The weight of the moment settled over Catherine like a shroud, but beneath the fear was something else. Something that had been growing stronger with each day she had spent in Millfield. It was the recognition that she had the power to choose her own fate, to stop being a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Marshall Thompson said with certainty. Christopher shook his head, his frustration evident in every line of his posture. Quote 35. Quote, the marshal replied, quote, Catherine found herself thinking about the months of humiliation and fear that had brought her to this moment. The constant weight of judgment and the exhausting effort required to maintain her dignity in the face of systematic cruelty. Timothy Brooks represented everything she had learned to hate about the world's treatment of women like herself, and the opportunity to bring him down was worth almost any risk. "I'll do it," she said again, and this time her voice carried a finality that silenced the objections around her. The next few hours passed in careful planning, with Marshall Thompson outlining the kind of evidence that would be needed to build a case against Timothy and the methods Catherine might use to obtain it. The conversation was interrupted periodically by the arrival of other witnesses, people who had finally found the courage to speak about their experiences with Timothy's reign of terror. Daniel Howard arrived first, his usual nervousness amplified by the gravity of what he was preparing to reveal. He spoke quietly about the systematic pressure Timothy had applied to force him to inflate his prices, the mysterious problems with suppliers that had plagued his business whenever he showed signs of resistance. Daniel explained, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. Quote 340. Robert James followed, his weathered face grim with years of suppressed anger, as he described Timothy's control over transportation in and out of Millfield. Anyone who wanted to leave town had to go through Timothy's people, he said. Somehow, tickets for the stage were always unavailable for people he wanted to keep here, or suddenly very expensive for those he wanted gone. The testimonies painted a picture of systematic control that went far beyond simple business competition. Timothy had created a web of influence that touched every aspect of life in Millfield, using fear and economic pressure to maintain his dominance over the community. But it was Kimberly Williams who provided the most damaging testimony, her young face marked by the kind of premature aging that came from surviving in a world that viewed women like her as disposable commodities. "Timothy owns the building where the girls work," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He sets the rules, decides who stays and who goes. Anyone who tries to leave without his permission finds themselves in trouble with the law, or worse." Catherine felt a chill at the implications of Kimberly's words. The young woman was describing a system of virtual slavery, where Timothy used his control over housing and employment to trap vulnerable women in situations they couldn't escape. "What kind of trouble?" Marshall Thompson asked gently. Kimberly's eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on Catherine's face, as if drawing strength from the older woman's steady presence. Code 346. The pattern was becoming clear, and Catherine could see the marshal's expression growing increasingly grim as he absorbed the scope of Timothy's criminal enterprise. This wasn't just about business competition or political corruption. It was about a man who had built his empire on the systematic exploitation and terrorization of anyone who couldn't fight back. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived to provide testimony, each adding another piece to the mosaic of Timothy's crimes. Catherine found herself thinking about Christina Evans, the woman whose courage in speaking to the territorial authorities had started this investigation. She wondered if Christina had felt the same mixture of fear and determination that was currently coursing through her own veins. When the formal interviews concluded, Catherine found herself alone with Christopher outside the skeletal church, the setting sun painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty of the moment felt surreal given the gravity of what she was preparing to undertake. "You don't have to do this," Christopher said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of emotions he seemed reluctant to name. "There might be other ways to stop Timothy, methods that don't require you to put yourself in danger." Catherine studied his face in the fading light, noting the lines of concern around his eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as if he was restraining himself from some action he couldn't quite define. She had grown accustomed to reading men's expressions for signs of threat or opportunity, but Christopher's face held something different, something that spoke of genuine care rather than calculation. Quote 349. She asked, the question emerging before she could stop herself. Quote 350. Christopher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where the last light was fading into purple shadows. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of carefully guarded truth. He said simply. Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than simple attraction or gratitude. Christopher wasn't offering to help her because he pitied her circumstances or hoped to gain something from her vulnerability. He was offering because he understood, on a level that transcended explanation, what it meant to stand alone against forces that seemed insurmountable. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. Christopher's smile was bitter and brief. The parallels between their stories weren't lost on Catherine, and she found herself studying Christopher's face with new understanding. He had offered her help not from a position of strength, looking down on weakness, but from the shared experience of someone who had learned to survive in a world that showed little mercy to those who fell outside its narrow definitions of acceptable behavior. Quote 3 quote 3/5, Christopher replied. Quote 357. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and Catherine felt her heart begin to race as she recognized the riders. Timothy Brooks was returning to Millfield, accompanied by several men she didn't recognize, but whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked them as people of influence and authority. "His reinforcements," Christopher said grimly, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Timothy's called in favors, brought in people with the kind of power that can make territorial investigations disappear." Catherine watched as the group dismounted in front of the silver dollar, noting the way other people on the street seemed to melt away from their presence. These weren't the rough frontier types that made up most of Millfield's population. These were men accustomed to wielding power in boardrooms and political chambers, and their arrival changed the entire dynamic of the conflict. "The game just got more dangerous," Christopher observed, his voice carrying a warning that Catherine felt in her bones. But as she watched Timothy's confident swagger as he led his associates into the saloon, Catherine felt her resolve harden rather than weaken. The arrival of outside support meant that Timothy felt threatened enough to call for help, which suggested that the investigation was having more impact than he had initially expected. Quote 361, she said quietly, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. Quote 362, Christopher turned to look at her, and Catherine could see something like admiration flickering in his eyes. Quote 363, quote 364, Catherine agreed, placing a protective hand over her belly where the child rested. Quote 360, the confrontation came sooner than Catherine had expected, arriving with the kind of inevitability that marked the collision of opposing forces that had been building toward each other for too long. She was returning from Helen's restaurant the following evening when she found Timothy Brooks waiting for her outside Martha Murphy's boarding house, his presence a dark promise against the gathering twilight. But Timothy wasn't alone. The men who flanked him were clearly the reinforcements Christopher had warned her about, their expensive clothes and cold eyes marking them as people accustomed to getting their way through methods that didn't rely on local intimidation. Catherine could feel the shift in power dynamics immediately, the sense that the rules of engagement had changed in ways that made her previous calculations obsolete. Quote 366, Timothy said, his voice carrying the mock courtesy that dangerous men used when they held overwhelming advantages. Quote 7. Catherine felt the familiar taste of copper fear flood her mouth, but she forced herself to maintain her composure as she studied the men arrayed before her. The investigation had clearly rattled Timothy more than he had initially let on, and the presence of outside support suggested that he was preparing for a more comprehensive response to the territorial authorities. Quote 368, Catherine replied, though even as she spoke, she was calculating the opportunities that this confrontation might provide. Marshall Thompson had been right about Timothy's inability to resist demonstrating his power over someone he perceived as defeated. Timothy's smile was sharp and predatory. Quote 369. One of the men beside Timothy stepped forward, his bearings suggesting military or law enforcement background. Quote 37. The name hit Catherine like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. Harrison was a common enough surname, and there was no reason to assume any connection to her former husband, but the coincidence felt like another twist of the knife that fate seemed determined to keep turning. Quote 371, Catherine said carefully. Quote 372. Harrison's expression didn't change, but Catherine caught a flicker of something in his eyes that suggested recognition. Her heart began to race as she realized that Timothy's investigation into her past might have uncovered connections she hadn't anticipated. Quote 373, Harrison said smoothly. Quote 374. The words hit Catherine like a sledgehammer, and she felt the world tilt around her as the full scope of Timothy's trap became clear. Samuel Harrison wasn't just a territorial attorney. He was her former husband's brother, a man who would have intimate knowledge of the scandal that had driven her from Philadelphia. I see you remember me, Harrison continued, his smile carrying the same cold cruelty that Catherine remembered from her former husband's family. 376. Catherine felt the baby stir restlessly within her, as if responding to her emotional turmoil, and she placed a protective hand over her belly. The gesture wasn't lost on Harrison, whose gaze sharpened with predatory interest. Yes, Richard mentioned that you'd found yourself in an interesting condition after leaving his protection, Harrison said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. I'm sure the good people of Millfield would be fascinated to learn the full story of how a respectable businessman's wife ended up pregnant and unmarried in a frontier town. The threat was clear and comprehensive, and Catherine could see Timothy's satisfaction at the way his trap was unfolding. He had brought in someone with intimate knowledge of her past, someone who could destroy her reputation with information that went far beyond simple scandal. But as Catherine looked into Harrison's cold eyes, she realized something that surprised her. The fear was still there, the familiar terror of exposure and judgment that had driven her from her former life. But it was no longer the overwhelming force that had once controlled her decisions. Months of struggle and humiliation had taught her that survival required a different kind of strength than she had ever imagined needing. What do you want, she asked, abandoning any pretense of ignorance about the connections that bound her to these men. Timothy's smile widened, and Catherine knew that she had just walked into the final phase of his carefully constructed trap. Timothy corrected smoothly, quote 383. Catherine could see the elegant cruelty of the strategy. Timothy wasn't just asking her to withdraw her accusations. He was asking her to destroy her own credibility so thoroughly that no future testimony would be believed. It was the kind of systematic character assassination that would follow her for the rest of her life. And if I refuse, Harrison stepped forward, his expression carrying the weight of legal authority, then I'm afraid your past will become a matter of public record. Adultery, abandonment of marriage vows, the kind of moral turpitude that territorial law takes very seriously, especially when it involves a woman in your current condition. The implications were clear. Harrison wasn't just threatening social ostracism, he was threatening legal consequences that could result in the loss of her child, imprisonment, or worse. The territorial authorities took a dim view of moral offenses, particularly when they involved women who had already demonstrated a pattern of questionable behavior. Catherine felt the trap closing around her with the inexorable force of a landslide. But she also felt something else, something that had been growing stronger with each day she had spent fighting for her place in Millfield. It was the recognition that she had already lost everything once, and that survival had taught her that there were worse things than exposure and judgment. Quote 386. She said finally, though her mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities that Timothy's overconfidence might provide. Timothy's expression darkened, but Harrison placed a restraining hand on his arm. The attorney said smoothly. Timothy said, his voice tight with barely controlled impatience. Quote 391. They turned and walked away, leaving Catherine standing alone in the gathering darkness with the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on her shoulders. She could hear the sounds of normal life continuing around her, people going about their evening routines without any awareness of the drama that was unfolding in their midst. But as she stood there, struggling with the magnitude of what Timothy and Harrison were asking her to do, Catherine became aware of a presence nearby. She turned to find Christopher Price emerging from the shadows between buildings, his expression grim with whatever he had overheard. She asked quietly. Quote 393, Christopher replied, his voice carrying a fury that surprised her with its intensity. Borrow 394. Catherine told him about Samuel Harrison's connection to her former husband, about the legal threats that went far beyond simple social ostracism. As she spoke, she watched Christopher's expression grow increasingly dangerous, and she realized that his protective instincts had been triggered by the threat to her and her child. Quote 395, Christopher said when she finished. Quote 397, quote, Catherine replied wearily. Quote, Christopher was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see him weighing possibilities that he seemed reluctant to voice. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of carefully considered decision. He said slowly, Catherine felt a flicker of hope, though she tried to suppress it. She had learned to be wary of solutions that seemed too good to be true, especially when they came at moments of maximum desperation. Quote 401. Christopher's expression was serious as he met her gaze. Marriage. If you were my wife, Harrison's threats would lose most of their legal force. Territorial law protects married women from certain kinds of moral prosecution, and your testimony would carry more weight coming from someone with an established position in the community. The proposal hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Catherine felt her heart begin to race as she absorbed the implications. Christopher wasn't offering marriage out of love or desire. He was offering it as a strategic alliance, a way to protect her from the legal and social consequences that Timothy and Harrison were threatening to unleash. Quote 403. Catherine said quietly. Quote 404. Quote 40. Christopher interrupted. Quote 407. Catherine studied his face in the gathering darkness, searching for signs of the calculation or ulterior motives she had learned to expect from men who offered help. But Christopher's expression remained steady and honest, without the predatory assessment that had marked her interactions with Timothy and Harrison. Why would you do this? She asked softly. Christopher was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of truth that couldn't be manufactured, or faked. Quote 408, he said simply. Quote 409, Mo. The words hit Catherine with unexpected force, and she felt tears threaten for the first time since Timothy's confrontation had begun. She had spent so many months believing that her value as a person had been irreparably damaged by the scandal and judgment that had driven her from her former life. The idea that someone might see her as worth protecting, worth standing beside in the face of social condemnation, was almost too powerful to accept. I can't ask you to sacrifice your future for mine, she said, though even as she spoke, she could feel her resistance crumbling under the weight of hope and desperation. You're not asking, Christopher replied. I'm offering. And it wouldn't be a sacrifice, Catherine. It would be a choice, made freely by someone who understands exactly what he's choosing. The proposal represented more than just protection from Timothy's threats. It represented the possibility of a future that Catherine had never dared to imagine. Not just survival, but the chance to build something meaningful with someone who saw her as more than the sum of her mistakes and misfortunes. But even as hope flared in her chest, Catherine knew that accepting Christopher's offer would mean abandoning the plan to gather evidence against Timothy. Marriage would provide protection, but it would also remove her from the position of vulnerability that made her useful to the investigation. What about Marshall Thompson's plan? She asked. If I marry you, Timothy won't approach me the same way. I won't be able to get close enough to his operation to gather the evidence we need. Christopher's expression grew troubled as he considered this complication. Code 415. But Catherine was already shaking her immediate, her mind working through the implications of the choice before her. Timothy and Harrison had revealed their hand too completely, had shown her the full scope of the weapons they were prepared to use against her. That knowledge gave her power, if she was brave enough to use it. Quote 416, she said quietly, her voice growing stronger as her resolve crystallized. Quote 417, quote 418, but Catherine was already thinking through the possibilities, calculating the opportunities that Timothy's overconfidence might provide. Marriage would protect me legally, but it wouldn't stop Timothy from continuing to terrorize other people. And if I'm going to be his wife, I'll have access to information and opportunities that a desperate unmarried woman wouldn't. Christopher stared at her in the darkness, and Catherine could see understanding dawning in his eyes. She wasn't just accepting his proposal for protection. She was proposing to use their marriage as a weapon against Timothy Brooks, a way to infiltrate his organization while maintaining the legal and social standing necessary to make her testimony credible. Quote 420, he said slowly. Quote 421, quote 422. Catherine replied simply. Quote 423. The plan was audacious in its simplicity, requiring perfect timing and nerves of steel to execute successfully. But as Catherine looked into Christopher's eyes, she saw something that gave her courage, the recognition that he trusted her judgment, even when it led them both into danger. When? Christopher asked, and Catherine knew that he had committed himself to whatever came next. Tomorrow morning, she said without hesitation, before Timothy's deadline. We'll present Harrison and Timothy with a fait accompli that changes all their calculations. The decision hung between them like a promise and a threat, binding them together in a partnership that would either save them both or destroy them completely. But as Catherine looked into Christopher's steady gaze, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the certainty that she wasn't facing the future alone. The wedding took place at dawn in the skeletal frame of Millfield's unfinished church, with Marshall Thompson serving as witness and Martha Murphy standing beside Catherine, with the kind of determined support that spoke of women who understood the necessity of unconventional alliances. The ceremony was brief and practical, stripped of romantic sentiment, but carrying a weight that surprised Catherine with its emotional resonance. Christopher's voice was steady as he spoke the words that bound them together, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face as they committed themselves to a partnership that transcended traditional definitions of marriage. Catherine found herself thinking about the irony of the moment, how she was entering into the most important relationship of her life as a strategic maneuver in a war she hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid fighting. Quote 427, Marshall Thompson said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Quote 428, the kiss that sealed their union was gentle and brief, but Catherine felt something shift inside her chest as Christopher's lips touched hers. It wasn't passion exactly, but something deeper and more sustainable, the recognition that they were no longer facing their individual battles alone. Martha Murphy embraced Catherine with tears in her eyes, her emotion genuine despite the unconventional circumstances. She whispered, the practical arrangements were handled quickly and efficiently, with Christopher moving Catherine's few belongings to his quarters above the freight office and Marshall Thompson preparing the legal documents that would establish her new status in the community. The speed of the transition was dizzying, but Catherine found herself grateful for the lack of time to second-guess decisions that felt simultaneously terrifying and inevitable. It was while they were settling into their new living arrangement that Timothy Brooks made his appearance, arriving at the freight office with Samuel Harrison in an expression of barely controlled fury. Catherine watched from the window as they approached, noting the way Timothy's confident swagger had been replaced by the tense energy of someone whose carefully laid plans had been disrupted. Quote 431, Timothy said when Christopher opened the door, his voice dripping with false courtesy. Quote 332, Catherine stepped forward to stand beside her new husband, drawing strength from his solid presence as she faced the men who had tried to destroy her. Quote 433, she said simply. Quote 434. Harrison's eyes were cold with calculation as he studied Catherine's face, clearly reassessing the legal and social implications of her changed status. Quote 435, he observed. Quote 436. Quote 437. Christopher replied smoothly. Quote 438. The lie was delivered with such conviction that Catherine almost believed it herself, and she could see the frustration building in Timothy's expression as he realized that his carefully constructed trap had been neutralized by a development he hadn't anticipated. Quote 439, Timothy said, his voice sharp with sarcasm. Quote 4, Catherine felt Christopher tense beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm before responding. Quote 441, she said, her voice carrying the kind of reasonable cooperation that she knew would frustrate Timothy's expectations. I'm always happy to assist law enforcement in any way I can. Excellent, Harrison said, though his tone suggested anything but satisfaction. Perhaps we could schedule a time for Mrs. Price to provide a more comprehensive statement about her observations of local business practices. The request was clearly a trap, an attempt to force Catherine into a situation where she would be pressured to recant her previous testimony or face the consequences of maintaining her accusations. But Catherine had spent the night thinking through the implications of her new status, and she was prepared for exactly this kind of maneuver. I think that would be best handled through proper legal channels, Christopher interjected. My wife's previous statements were given as a private citizen under considerable duress. Any future testimony should be provided with appropriate legal representation present. Catherine could see the fury building in Timothy's eyes as he realized that his psychological weapons had been blunted by her changed circumstances. A married woman with an established position in the community couldn't be intimidated or discredited as easily as a desperate unmarried mother. Of course, Harrison said through gritted teeth. We wouldn't want to violate anyone's legal rights. After they left, Catherine and Christopher stood together in the quiet of the freight office, both of them understanding that the real battle was just beginning. Timothy had been outmaneuvered tactically, but he still possessed the resources and connections to wage a longer campaign against them. He'll try something else, Christopher said quietly. Men like Timothy don't give up just because one strategy fails. Catherine nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. But now I have something I didn't have before: legal protection, social standing, and a partner who understands what we're fighting for. The afternoon brought visitors, some offering congratulations and others clearly fishing for information about the sudden marriage. Catherine found herself navigating the complex social dynamics of frontier society, where her new status as Christopher's wife granted her a respectability that her previous circumstances had made impossible. Helen Sanders was among the first to arrive, her face glowing with genuine happiness at Catherine's changed fortunes. I always knew you were stronger than you appeared, she said, embracing Catherine warmly. And Christopher's a good man. You couldn't have chosen better. Daniel Howard came by the store, his nervousness evident as he congratulated them on their marriage, while clearly wondering what it meant for the ongoing investigation into Timothy's activities. Yeah, 4540 quoted 4, so I tell Mr. How, Catherine assured him. Quoted 4 and 5-6. But it was Kimberly Williams whose visit carried the most weight. The young woman arriving at dusk with the kind of desperate courage that spoke of someone who had finally found the strength to speak about things that had been hidden too long. On 457, Kimberly said quietly, her eyes darting nervously toward the street. Quote 458, Catherine felt her heart clench at the hope and fear warring in the young woman's voice. What do you want to tell him? Kimberly's hands trembled as she spoke about the systematic abuse that Timothy had orchestrated, the way he used his control over housing and employment to trap vulnerable women in situations they couldn't escape. Her testimony was devastating in its implications, painting a picture of criminal enterprise that went far beyond simple business corruption. He keeps records, Kimberly said, her voice barely above a whisper. Names, dates, payments. He's careful about documenting everything, like he's proud of what he's built. Catherine felt her pulse quicken at this revelation. What kind of records? Where does he keep them? In his office above the silver dollar, there's a safe behind a painting of some fancy lady. He doesn't think any of us girls are smart enough to notice things like that, but I've seen him opening it when he thinks no one's watching. The information was exactly what Marshall Thompson needed to build a case against Timothy, but obtaining it would require someone to break into his private office and crack his safe. It was the kind of operation that could easily go wrong, with consequences that would extend far beyond legal prosecution. Would you be willing to tell Marshall Thompson what you just told me? Catherine asked. Kimberly nodded, though her fear was evident in every line of her posture. If you think it would help, if you think someone might finally listen. Catherine assured her that Marshall Thompson would listen, and they arranged for Kimberly to provide formal testimony the following day. But as the young woman prepared to leave, she turned back with one final piece of information that changed everything. There's something else, Kimberly said quietly. Timothy's planning something for tomorrow night. Something big. I heard him talking to those fancy men about making sure that troublemakers understand the consequences of interfering with his business. The words sent a chill through Catherine, and she exchanged a meaningful glance with Christopher. Timothy wasn't just planning to wait for the investigation to go its course. He was preparing to take direct action against anyone who had spoken out against him. Quote 468, Christopher asked, his voice tight with concern. Quote 4000, Kimberly replied. Quote 70. After Kimberly left, Catherine and Christopher sat in their small living space, both of them understanding that the conflict with Timothy had entered its final phase. The marriage had provided them with protection and legal standing, but it had also escalated the stakes to a level where Timothy might be willing to risk everything to maintain his control over Millfield. Quote 471, Christopher said. Quote 472. Catherine nodded, but her mind was already working through the implications of what Kimberly had revealed. Quote 473, and Christopher stared at her in the lamplight, and Catherine could see understanding dawning in his eyes. Quote 47, quote 5, Catherine replied, quote 5, the plan was audacious in its simplicity, requiring precise timing and nerves of steel to execute successfully. But Catherine had learned that sometimes the most direct approach was the most effective, especially when dealing with men who had grown overconfident in their own power. Quote 477, Christopher said firmly. Quote 478. Catherine felt a surge of emotion at his words, the recognition that she had found someone who truly understood the meaning of partnership. They spent the rest of the evening planning their approach to Timothy's office, studying the layout of the building and identifying the best methods for gaining access to the safe. But even as they prepared for what might be the most dangerous night of their lives, Catherine found herself thinking about the transformation that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a broken woman fleeing the wreckage of her former life. Now she was preparing to risk everything to protect a community that had given her a chance to rebuild herself. The woman who stepped off that stage in Millfield was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from choosing which battles were worth fighting. And as Catherine looked into Christopher's steady gaze, she knew that whatever happened tomorrow night, she was no longer facing the future alone. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood like a fortress against the star-filled Nevada sky, its windows glowing with the warm light of oil lamps and the harsh laughter of men who had learned to find comfort in whiskey and violence. Catherine crouched in the shadows between buildings, her heart hammering against her ribs as she studied the rhythms of Timothy Brooks's empire, looking for the moment when opportunity would align with courage. Christopher pressed close beside her, his breathing steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. The plan they had developed was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Wait for the saloon to reach its peak of activity, when Timothy would be occupied with his customers and the noise would mask any sounds from the office above. The back stairs, Christopher whispered, pointing to a narrow wooden staircase that led to the second floor. Kimberly said Timothy usually stays downstairs until well past midnight when he's entertaining those territorial officials. Catherine nodded, though her mouth was dry with fear and anticipation. The child within her stirred restlessly, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them, and she placed a protective hand over her belly. She was risking not just her own life, but the future of the innocent life she carried. But the alternative was to allow Timothy's reign of terror to continue unchecked. They waited in the shadows as the evening progressed, watching the ebb and flow of customers entering and leaving the saloon. Catherine could see Timothy through the windows, holding court at his usual table with Samuel Harrison and several other well-dressed men whose presence marked them as people of influence and authority. Quote date 1. Christopher said quietly, and they moved together across the narrow alley that separated them from their target. The back stairs creaked ominously under their weight, each step seeming to echo like thunder in the desert night. Catherine found herself holding her breath as they climbed, her ears straining for any sound that might indicate they had been discovered. The door to Timothy's office was locked, but Christopher had come prepared with tools that spoke of skills he had acquired during his own mysterious past. The lock yielded to his ministrations with surprising ease, and they slipped inside the darkened room that served as the nerve center of Timothy's criminal empire. Catherine had expected something grand and intimidating, but Timothy's office was surprisingly modest, containing a desk, several chairs, and filing cabinets that looked like they had seen better days. The only indication of wealth was the painting that Kimberly had mentioned, an ornate portrait of a woman in elaborate dress that dominated one wall. There, Christopher whispered, moving toward the painting with the kind of focused intensity that spoke of someone accustomed to working under pressure. The safe behind the painting was larger than Catherine had expected, a substantial steel box that would require considerable expertise to open. Christopher examined the lock mechanism with the careful attention of someone who understood such things, his fingers tracing the dial with professional assessment. "Can you open it?" Catherine asked, though she kept her voice barely above a whisper. "Give me a few minutes," Christopher replied, already beginning the delicate process of manipulating the combination lock. Catherine moved to the window that overlooked the main street, positioning herself where she could watch for any sign that their presence had been detected. The saloon below continued its raucous activity, but she could see Timothy's associates moving restlessly, as if they sensed something amiss. The sound of the safe opening was barely audible, but Catherine felt a surge of triumph as Christopher gestured for her to join him. Inside the steel box was exactly what Kimberly had promised. Stacks of documents, ledgers, and correspondence that detailed the full scope of Timothy's criminal activities. "Look at this," Christopher whispered, holding up a leather-bound ledger that contained meticulous records of bribes, threats, and systematic intimidation. "He's documented everything, like he's proud of what he's built." Catherine began gathering the most damaging documents, her hands shaking with excitement and fear as she realized the magnitude of what they had discovered. There were records of payments to territorial officials, detailed plans for forcing business owners to sell their properties, and correspondence that revealed connections to criminal enterprises throughout the Nevada territory. But it was a particular folder marked Problem Resolution that contained the most devastating evidence. Inside were detailed plans for dealing with people who opposed Timothy's interests, including photographs and personal information about potential targets. Catherine's blood ran cold as she recognized several names on the list, including her own and Christopher's. But it was the notation beside Christina Evans's name that made her gasp in horror. "Permanent solution implemented. Family relocated to avoid complications." "Christopher," she whispered, showing him the document. "Christina Evans." Timothy didn't just force her to leave town. Christopher's expression grew murderous as he absorbed the implications of what they had discovered. Quote 4918. The revelation transformed their mission from simple evidence gathering to something approaching a moral imperative. They weren't just fighting to protect themselves or even the people of Millfield. They were seeking justice for victims whose voices had been permanently silenced. They worked quickly to photograph the most important documents, using a small camera that Christopher had acquired for this purpose. The process was painstaking, requiring careful positioning and adequate light, but they managed to capture images of the most damaging evidence. It was while they were finishing this work that Catherine heard the sound that made her blood freeze. Footsteps on the back stairs, moving with the kind of deliberate purpose that suggested someone who belonged there. "Someone's coming," she whispered, her heart racing as she realized their time had run out. Christopher immediately began returning documents to the safe, his movements quick and efficient despite the pressure they were under. But Catherine could hear the footsteps getting closer, and she knew they wouldn't have time to restore everything to its original condition. Quote 493, Christopher said, gesturing toward the opening that looked out onto the alley behind the building. Quote 494, dude. Catherine looked at the distance to the ground and felt a surge of terror. The drop was considerable, and in her condition, a fall could be catastrophic for both her and the child she carried. But the alternative was to face Timothy Brooks in his own stronghold with evidence of their break-in scattered around his office. Quote 495, wow, she whispered. Quote 496. Christopher's expression was grim as he calculated their options. The footsteps were at the door now, and they could hear someone fumbling with keys. In seconds, they would be discovered, and all their careful planning would be for nothing. "Then we fight," Christopher said simply, positioning himself between Catherine and the door. "Whatever happens, we don't let him destroy this evidence." The door opened just as Christopher finished speaking, and Timothy Brooks stepped into his office with the kind of casual confidence that spoke of someone who had never encountered meaningful opposition. But his expression changed immediately as he took in the scene before him. His safe standing open, documents scattered across his desk, and the two people he had tried so hard to control standing in the middle of his private domain. "Well," Timothy said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that was more frightening than any display of rage. "This is unexpected." Catherine felt Christopher tense beside her, and she knew that violence was only moments away. But as she looked into Timothy's cold eyes, she realized that fear was no longer the dominant emotion in her chest. Instead, she felt the kind of righteous anger that came from finally understanding the full scope of the evil she was fighting against. Quote 501, Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Quote 50. Timothy's smile was sharp and predatory. "Do you, And what exactly do you think you're going to do with that knowledge? We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth about what you are, Catherine replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Starting with Marshall Thompson and the territorial authorities, Timothy's laughter was cold and humorless. Quote 506. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow as she realized the full scope of Timothy's plan. He wasn't just going to silence them. He was going to stage their deaths to look like an accident, eliminating the threat they represented while maintaining plausible deniability. But even as terror flooded through her system, Catherine felt something else rising to meet it. The stubborn determination that had carried her through months of struggle and humiliation. Timothy Brooks had underestimated her once again, assuming that fear would paralyze her when faced with the ultimate threat. Quote 507, she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Odawarid 508. It was a bluff, but Catherine delivered it with such conviction that she saw uncertainty flicker across Timothy's features. He hadn't expected resistance at this point, hadn't planned for the possibility that his victims might have anticipated his response. You're lying, Timothy said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Am I? Catherine replied. Why don't you go ask Marshall Thompson what he received this evening? Or better yet, ask him about the territorial officials who are already on their way to Millfield to investigate your operation. The lie was growing more elaborate, but Catherine could see it was having an effect. Timothy's carefully constructed world was built on control and predictability, and the possibility that events had moved beyond his ability to manipulate them was clearly rattling his composure. Christopher stepped forward, adding his voice to Catherine's deception. It's over, Timothy. The only question now is whether you're going to make this worse for yourself by adding murder to the charges you're already facing. For a moment, Timothy seemed to waver, his gaze shifting between Catherine and Christopher as he calculated his options. But then his expression hardened, and Catherine knew that he had decided to gamble everything on silencing them permanently. I don't think so, Timothy said, his hand moving toward the weapon at his side. I think you're both lying, and I think you're about to discover the consequences of crossing Timothy Brooks. The confrontation had reached its climax, and Catherine realized that everything she had fought for, everything she had built in Millfield, was about to be decided in the next few moments. But as she looked into Christopher's steady gaze, she felt something that surprised her with its intensity. The absolute certainty that she would rather die fighting for justice than live in submission to evil. The battle for Millfield was about to reach its bloody conclusion, and Catherine Carter was finally ready to face whatever came next. The moment stretched like a wire drawn to its breaking point, with Timothy's hand hovering over his weapon and Catherine's heart hammering against her ribs as she calculated the odds of survival. But before Timothy could draw his gun, the sound of approaching footsteps on the stairs shattered the tense silence, and voices could be heard calling out with the authority of law enforcement. For 515, Timothy's expression shifted from predatory confidence to desperate calculation as he realized that Catherine's bluff had somehow become reality. The territorial authorities had indeed arrived, and his carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him with the speed of a house of cards in a windstorm. Hook 5-6. Timothy said, his voice tight with fury and disbelief. Catherine felt a surge of triumph mixed with confusion. She had been bluffing about contacting Marshall Thompson, but somehow the marshal had arrived at exactly the right moment. It was only when she heard a familiar voice among those in the hallway that she understood what had happened. Quote 57. It was Kimberly Williams, and Catherine realized that the young woman must have seen them entering the building and alerted the authorities. The girl's courage in seeking help had saved their lives and possibly the entire investigation. We're here, Catherine called out, her voice carrying clearly through the door. Timothy Brooks is armed and dangerous. Timothy's face contorted with rage as he realized that his final gambit had failed. But instead of surrendering, he raised his weapon with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. He snarled. Christopher moved with lightning speed, throwing himself between Catherine and Timothy's gun just as the weapon discharged. The sound was deafening in the confined space, and Catherine screamed as she saw Christopher stagger backward, blood spreading across his shirt. But Timothy's shot had also served as a signal to the marshals outside, and the door exploded inward as armed men poured into the office. Timothy tried to swing his weapon toward the new threats, but he was overwhelmed before he could fire again. Tackled to the ground by deputies who had been waiting for exactly this kind of resistance. Catherine dropped to her knees beside Christopher, her hands shaking as she examined the wound in his shoulder. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting any vital organs, but he was losing blood at an alarming rate. Code 522, Christopher said through gritted teeth, though his face was pale with pain and shock. Quote 593. Marshal Thompson was already examining the scattered papers, his expression growing grimmer as he absorbed the scope of Timothy's criminal activities. This is more than enough to prosecute, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had finally cornered a dangerous predator. Timothy Brooks, you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, murder, and about a dozen other charges that will keep you in territorial prison for the rest of your life. Timothy struggled against the deputies who held him, his face twisted with the kind of impotent rage that came from seeing absolute power dissolve into complete helplessness. You can't prove anything, he spat. Those documents could have been forged. The testimony of whores and desperate women won't stand up in territorial court. Maybe not, Marshal Thompson replied calmly. But the testimony of territorial officials who were being bribed will, and the bank records that show exactly where your money was coming from and where it was going, and the physical evidence that ties you to the deaths of Christina Evans and her children. The words hit Timothy like physical blows, and Catherine could see the moment when he realized that his carefully constructed defenses had crumbled completely. The network of corruption and intimidation that had protected him for years was turning against him, as former allies rushed to save themselves by cooperating with the authorities. Samuel Harrison was among the first to be arrested, his legal credentials providing no protection against the evidence of his participation in Timothy's schemes. Catherine watched with grim satisfaction as the man who had threatened to use her past against her was led away in chains, his own future now subject to the kind of legal scrutiny he had tried to weaponize against others. The aftermath of the arrest was chaotic, with territorial officials working through the night to process evidence and take statements from witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak openly about Timothy's crimes. Catherine found herself at the center of it all, her testimony now carrying the weight of someone whose credibility had been established through marriage and whose courage had been proven through action. Dr. Samuel Mitchell, the territorial physician who had been summoned to treat Christopher's wound, worked with professional efficiency to clean and bandage the injury. Catherine recognized the irony that a man named Mitchell was caring for her husband, given that her friendship with a Dr. Mitchell in Philadelphia had been part of the scandal that drove her west. Quote 530. Dr. Mitchell assured Catherine as he finished his work. Quote 531. Catherine felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she absorbed the news that Christopher would survive his injury. The man who had risked everything to protect her and fight for justice would live to see Timothy Brooks brought to trial. As dawn broke over Millfield, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine found herself standing on the steps of the territorial courthouse that had been established in the town's largest building. The sight was symbolic in ways that weren't lost on anyone present. Justice had finally come to a place that had been ruled by fear and corruption for too long. Helen Sanders was among the first to arrive, her face glowing with the kind of relief that came from finally being free of a threat that had shadowed her life for years. "But at 532, she said, embracing Catherine with tears in her eyes. Quote 533. Daniel Howard came by to express his gratitude, his usual nervousness replaced by a confidence that spoke of someone who had rediscovered his own courage. Quote 534, he said. Quote 535. But it was Martha Murphy's words that carried the most weight, the older woman speaking with the wisdom of someone who had seen too much of life's cruelty and injustice. Quote 536, she said quietly. Quote 537. The trial, when it came, was swift and decisive. The evidence against Timothy was overwhelming, and his former associates rushed to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. Catherine's testimony was particularly damaging, her account of Timothy's blackmail attempt and systematic intimidation painting a picture of a man who had built his empire on the suffering of others. Timothy himself maintained his arrogance to the end, refusing to show remorse or acknowledge the harm he had caused. But his defiance only served to underscore the justice of his conviction, and when the judge sentenced him to life in territorial prison, the courtroom erupted in applause from the people whose lives he had terrorized. The transformation of Millfield in the months that followed was remarkable to witness. Businesses that had struggled under Timothy's systematic pressure began to thrive. New families moved to town, attracted by the promise of honest opportunity, and the atmosphere of fear that had pervaded the community gradually gave way to something approaching normalcy. Catherine's own transformation was equally dramatic. The frightened, desperate woman who had stepped off the stage 6 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered her own strength and worth through the crucible of conflict. Her marriage to Christopher had begun as a strategic alliance, but it had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful as they learned to trust and depend on each other. The birth of their daughter came in the spring, a healthy child who entered the world with the kind of fierce determination that seemed to run in her mother's blood. Catherine held the baby in her arms and marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the depths of despair and humiliation to the heights of love and fulfillment. "What should we call her?" Christopher asked, his voice soft with wonder as he studied his daughter's tiny features. Catherine considered the question carefully, thinking about the women who had shaped her journey to this moment. "Quote 539, she said finally. Quote 540. The choice was perfect in its simplicity, representing not just their daughter's future, but the transformation that had occurred in Millfield and in their own lives. Hope for justice, hope for redemption, hope for the possibility that good people could triumph over evil if they were willing to stand together and fight for what was right. As Catherine looked into her daughter's eyes, she saw reflected there all the possibilities that the future might hold. The child would grow up in a world where women like her mother could find strength in adversity, where communities could come together to resist tyranny, and where justice was more than just an abstract ideal. The woman who had once believed herself broken beyond repair had discovered that true strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from choosing which battles were worth fighting. And in fighting for Millfield, for justice, and for the right to determine her own destiny, Catherine Carter Price had found something more valuable than safety or respectability. She had found herself. The years that followed brought changes to Millfield that few could have imagined during Timothy Brooks's reign of terror. The town grew and prospered as word spread throughout the territory about a place where honest business could thrive without the threat of systematic corruption and intimidation. New families arrived regularly, drawn by opportunities that had been impossible when Timothy controlled every aspect of the local economy. Catherine found herself at the center of many of these changes, her reputation as someone who had stood up to tyranny, making her a natural leader in the community's efforts to build something better from the ashes of the old system. She served on the town council, helped establish the first proper school, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Christopher's freight business expanded dramatically as trade routes that had been controlled by Timothy's associates opened up to honest competition. The man who had once operated on the margins of Millfield society found himself one of the town's most respected citizens, his courage in standing up to Timothy having earned him a reputation that extended far beyond the Nevada territory. Their marriage, which had begun as a strategic alliance born of necessity, had deepened into a partnership that surprised both of them with its strength and satisfaction. They had learned to trust each other completely, to share not just the burdens of daily life, but the dreams and aspirations that drove them forward. Hope Price grew into a bright, determined child who seemed to inherit the best qualities of both her parents. She had Catherine's intelligence and moral courage, combined with Christopher's steady determination and practical wisdom. Watching her daughter play in the garden behind their expanded home, Catherine often marveled at the journey that had brought them all to this place of peace and prosperity. The trials that had followed Timothy's arrest had revealed the full scope of his criminal empire, leading to prosecutions that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Several officials who had taken bribes from Timothy found themselves facing their own legal consequences, and the entire system of corruption that had enabled his activities was systematically dismantled. Timothy himself had died in prison 3 years after his conviction, his health broken by the harsh conditions and his spirit crushed by the complete collapse of everything he had built. Catherine felt no satisfaction at the news of his death, only a quiet sense of closure that came from knowing that his victims had finally received justice. Samuel Harrison had received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation with the authorities, but his legal career was effectively over, and he had left the territory in disgrace. Catherine occasionally wondered what had become of him, but she found that the anger and fear he had once inspired had faded into something approaching indifference. The investigation into Christina Evans' death had confirmed Catherine's worst suspicions. Timothy had indeed arranged for the woman and her children to be murdered when they threatened to expose his activities to the territorial authorities. The discovery of their bodies in a remote canyon had provided the final piece of evidence needed to ensure Timothy's conviction, and their deaths had been avenged by the justice that Catherine and Christopher had helped to bring about. Kimberly Williams had used the reward money from Timothy's conviction to start a new life in California, where she had married a decent man and was raising a family of her own. She wrote to Catherine occasionally, her letters filled with gratitude for the courage that had inspired her to speak out against her tormentor. Helen Sanders had sold her restaurant to a young couple from back east, using the proceeds to retire comfortably in a small house near the center of town. She spent her days tending a garden that had become famous throughout Millfield for its beauty and productivity, and she often told visitors about the pregnant woman who had refused to be intimidated by the most dangerous man in the territory. Martha Murphy continued to operate her boarding house, which had become a destination for respectable travelers who appreciated her no-nonsense approach to hospitality. She had become something of a local legend herself, known for her ability to spot trouble before it started and her willingness to stand up for anyone who needed protection. Marshall Thompson had been promoted to territorial supervisor. His successful prosecution of Timothy Brooks, having established his reputation as someone who could handle even the most complex cases of frontier corruption. He visited Millfield regularly, always stopping by to check on Catherine and Christopher and to marvel at the transformation that had occurred in the town. The changes weren't limited to individual success stories. Millfield itself had been transformed from a place where fear and intimidation ruled to a community that prided itself on fairness and opportunity. The saloon that had once served as Timothy's headquarters had been converted into a community center, and the building that had housed his private office now served as the town library. A proper church had finally been completed, its bell tower visible from miles away as a symbol of the community's commitment to moral principles and spiritual growth. Catherine often attended services there with her family, finding peace in the simple rituals and the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who shared her values. The unfinished church where she and Christopher had been married had been preserved as a historical monument, a reminder of the desperate times when justice had seemed impossible and hope had been in short supply. Visitors to Millfield often asked to see the place where the famous confrontation with Timothy Brooks had begun, and Catherine would sometimes guide tours through the building, telling the story of how ordinary people had found the courage to stand up to extraordinary evil. But it was in the quiet moments of domestic life that Catherine found her greatest satisfaction. Watching Hope take her first steps, teaching her to read, listening to her laugh as she played with the other children in town. These were the rewards that made all the struggle and danger worthwhile. Christopher had proven to be a devoted father, his natural protectiveness extending seamlessly to encompass his daughter's welfare and development. He taught Hope to ride, to understand the basics of business, and to appreciate the importance of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult or dangerous. The three of them would often sit together in the evenings, Catherine reading aloud while Christopher worked on his ledgers and Hope played with her toys. These moments of peaceful domesticity felt like miracles to Catherine, who remembered too clearly the desperation and loneliness that had once defined her existence. Sometimes visitors would ask Catherine about her past, curious about the scandal that had driven her from Philadelphia to the frontier. She had learned to speak about those experiences without shame or defensiveness, recognizing that her journey from victim to victor was part of what made her story inspiring to others who faced their own struggles. She would tell them, quote 5:4-2, "The woman who had once believed herself irreparably damaged by scandal and judgment had become someone who understood that true worth came from within, that respect had to be earned rather than inherited, and that the most important battles were often fought not for personal gain, but for the welfare of others." Catherine's story had spread far beyond Millfield, inspiring other women who found themselves in desperate circumstances to believe that survival was possible, that dignity could be reclaimed, and that even the most powerful oppressors could be brought to justice if people were willing to stand together and fight for what was right. But for Catherine herself, the greatest victory wasn't the fame or recognition that had come from her role in Timothy's downfall. It was the simple knowledge that she had found her place in the world, that she was surrounded by people who loved and respected her, and that her daughter would grow up in a community where courage and justice were valued above power and wealth. As she stood on the porch of her home, watching the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Millfield, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of peace and fulfillment. The frightened woman who had stepped off that stage 6 months ago seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life who had been transformed by fire into something stronger and more resilient. The battle for Millfield was over, but the war for justice and dignity continued in communities throughout the territory and beyond. Catherine knew that her role in that larger struggle was far from finished, that there would always be people who needed someone to stand up for them, someone to show them that resistance was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. But for now, in this moment of quiet satisfaction, she was content to be Catherine Carter Price, wife and mother, citizen of a community that had learned to value courage over comfort and justice over expediency. The woman who had once believed herself beyond redemption had discovered that the most important transformations often began with the simple decision to stop running and start fighting. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, and Catherine smiled as she heard Hope's laughter drifting from the garden, where Christopher was pushing their daughter on the swing he had built for her. This was what victory looked like, not the dramatic confrontations or public vindication, but the quiet moments of love and security that made all the struggle worthwhile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of others who needed hope and support. But tonight, Catherine Carter Price was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by the family and community she had helped to build from the ashes of corruption and fear. The fat, pregnant woman who had looked Timothy Brooks dead in the eye and refused to back down had become something even more powerful. A woman who understood her own worth and was willing to fight for it, no matter what the cost. And in that transformation lay the true victory, the knowledge that evil could be defeated not through violence or hatred, but through the simple refusal to surrender to despair.